the core of the problem is the fact that, whether we like it or not, in international law, Gaza is an occupied territory and always has been. It's part of the Palestinian occupied territories, the part of that land that was designated to be a Palestinian state.
So we've been talking throughout the programme today about the euphoria that was felt when the 20 living hostages came home yesterday, and the concern about those who have not yet been returned, the bodies of those who've not yet been returned. There is still a long way to go before peace is achieved in the Middle East, despite what Donald Trump said as he left the region yesterday. A long way, a lot has been achieved so far, but how do we move on from here? Oliver McTernan is the director of conflict resolution charity Forward Thinking. He's worked in negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians in the past, including the release of the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, who was taken hostage in 2006 and released in 2011. He joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning, Kate.
In terms of the next steps here, we've heard from a number of experts in the region on the programme this morning, their concerns, their frustration perhaps, and their worries about how Hamas could be encouraged to leave its weapons and move forward. What is your view on what needs to happen next to achieve that?
Well, first of all, Kate, I'd like to share the relief, I would say, of many people seeing the living hostages being returned to their families, and one knows the joy that that must bring them, and also the Palestinian prisoners coming back home. But as for the future, I think there are many, many concerns. And my major concern is that the Trump plan, or the vision, or whatever they call it, is drawn up with no reference to international law. Now, that worries me. We saw a gathering of world leaders at Sharm el-Sheikh endorsing a plan that doesn't refer to the basics of the rule-based order that grew out of the terrible horrors of the Second World War. Why do I say that? Because the core of the problem is the fact that, whether we like it or not, in international law, Gaza is an occupied territory and always has been. It's part of the Palestinian occupied territories, the part of that land that was designated to be a Palestinian state. Now, the failure to address that fundamental issue, I think, is going to come back to haunt us.
And that is one of the biggest questions here, is who could take that issue forward, and is there an appetite to do that? Do you see that in any of the conversations that we are seeing take place at the moment?
I don't, Kate, because I think we're locked at present in a mindset, and Trump expressed it, and Netanyahu constantly expresses it, and it's peace through strength. Now, that's been a policy for centuries. I remind them that Alexander the Great, 300 years BC, thought he could bring peace through might or through strength in Gaza. After 3 years, he found it was impossible. He left. We meet the Crusaders trying to do the same, the Turks trying to do the same. Napoleon lasted 2 weeks in Gaza. All of them fail because peace through strength, this philosophy of how you bring peace, has its limitations. It may bring temporary stability, but it's unsustainable. We haven't time to go into all of those reasons. I think true peace comes as we more or less discovered in Ireland. True peace comes through justice. That's making space for the other to be, seeing your security in a good relationship with the other and not in military might or domination.
And one of the things I think we often struggle with, and we've said this before on this programme, is trying to understand the mindset. What is driving Hamas and the people in that region who, as you've sort of hinted at there, I suppose, the way that Israel approaches this is never going to work. It is about a shift or an understanding or an ability to work out what the motivations are. You've negotiated between both sides. What do you think is in the minds of those Hamas fighters right now? Where do you think they would be willing to change course, compromise, reset, rethink?
Kate, that's a very good question and a very difficult one to answer. I think first and foremost, we have to see Hamas, I think, as part of the Palestinian resistance. My concern of late is that we're being given a narrative that says this is clash of civilizations. It's a war against radical Islam. It's being fought in Gaza today. It'll be in Berlin and London tomorrow if we don't have victory. I think that's a very dangerous narrative and could lead to global consequences if we don't check it. The Palestinian issue, I think, is essentially grievance driven. It's not ideological driven. And over the years, the engagement I've had with Hamas, and close engagement for 5 years with the Gilad Shalit release, it is essentially a resistance movement. It uses Islamic reference to justify what many of us would say legally and morally is reprehensible actions, but that is argued, and that's why it's always kept within the sphere of what they would say occupation or the area of war. It hasn't become a global threat and hasn't acted outside the areas that they would say are justified within Islamic teachings. Now, I think it's important to understand that, because you can then engage. And over the years, I found it really possible. What we've forgot in the narrative or in the commentaries that are being made over the past 2 years is that 2006, Hamas made a fundamental shift from military activity to political. They stood for election, won the election. What was the reaction both in Israel and, if I may say, more so by Condoleezza Rice and the Bush administration, was to reject it. And that rejection in 2006, I think, strengthened the military wing of Hamas. They said the political is no good. Again, they worked for 4 years with some senior American former diplomats and European former diplomats to draw up a new political program. And in that political program, published in 2017, they actually acknowledged the step would be a two-state solution on 67 borders. What happened? Totally ignored. So I think every effort to what happened in Ireland, where Sinn Féin IRA was successful in persuading the military wing that the time had come to move from military resistance into a political process. Every time Hamas tried that, in my observation, and in explaining it, I'm not justifying any of this or endorsing it, but in that process, every time they've been rejected. And that, of course, then gives strength to the military leadership. And I fear that's what we've witnessed over the past 17, 18 years in Gaza.
And the answer from here is, as you've just set out the context there, really very difficult to achieve, and certainly difficult to achieve quickly. Oliver, really appreciate you giving us that context here today. Thank you for joining us on the programme.
Kate.
Thank you.
It is achievable. That's the important thing.
It is, and that's optimism there, a note of optimism there to end the conversation. Oliver McTernan, the Director of Conflict Resolution Charity Forward Thinking. We do have some news from Gaza. It is breaking in the last few moments. The IDF, which is the source for this, says several suspects were identified crossing the yellow line and approaching IDF troops operating in the northern Gaza Strip, which the IDF says constitutes a violation of the agreement that was reached yesterday. Attempts were made to distance the suspects. Again, this is the IDF's line. The suspects did not comply and continued approaching the troops, who opened fire to remove the threat. The IDF calls on Gaza residents to follow its instructions and not to approach the troops deployed in the area. There had been reports of an infiltration to the IDF position. The Israeli military says this is not correct.
So it's lasted, that ceasefire, 12 hours or whatever before there's already some issue of it being compromised.